Good morning, everyone. My name is Matthew Evenden. I'm one of the Associate Vice Presidents of Research and Innovation at the UBC Vancouver campus. And we're pleased to have you join us today virtually and in person for a discussion of the UBC Research Data Management Strategy. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement for those of us located in the Vancouver campus. Of course, we're located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Some of you connecting online from other parts of the Lower Mainland may well be on traditional, unceded, ancestral territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, or Musqueam as well. And then, of course, from other First Nations beyond the Vancouver area. Our colleagues in the Okanagan conduct their work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Silks Okanagan Nation. So our agenda today, first of all, thank you so much for attending today. We're really keen to solicit feedback from our colleagues across different areas of research and different parts of the institution. And we've tried to lay out the discussion today to provide a lot of opportunity at the end for question and answer. Many of the documents that are relevant to this discussion have been posted. You can explore in detail online, but we think we should probably begin with some background on research data management, just so we're all speaking a common language. We can give you a brief summary of the background on how the tri-agencies have approached research data management policy and how we're trying to meet the new expectations of the tri-agencies in this area. We're going to share with you elements of the draft strategy that's been in development for well over a year and is the result of a good deal of discussion and town halls like this one and on both campuses. We'll highlight some of the key recommendations for you, and then we're going to talk about some of the next steps in the process as we think about implementation and steps forward. And then we want to open it up as soon as possible for a question and answer session. So briefly, right now you can, if you're online, post questions in the Q&A, the chat. Eugene Barsky, who you see on your screen, is going to be managing all of that for us, and he'll be able to relay the questions that you pose in the chat in the discussion section at the end. And a really key point, if you wouldn't mind, please do go to the feedback form that we've posted at the bottom of the slide here. Maybe Eugene can pop that into the chat as well for those of you online. And feel free to share this abundantly with your colleagues. We really would like to get as much feedback as we can on the directions we've taken as a community, and ensure that we respond to concerns that might arise. So how to get involved? Of course, you're here now, so you're already involved. There's the opportunity to provide feedback through the ARC website. And we're going to be having a few more of these sessions for more focused discussion on particular themes, because we all know that research data management unfolds somewhat differently depending on your research area. If you're in the health sciences, you have a whole set of different constraints and ethical considerations than you might if you're working in the social sciences. There are particular concerns when conducting Indigenous research and thinking about community collaboration. So we've made sure that there's an opportunity to focus on those sorts of issues at one time in particular as well. So there's the list of sessions. They're posted on our website too. Again, if you have colleagues who might be interested in one or several of these, we'd be happy if you pass that along. Finally, just to give you a sense of how this research data management strategy has developed over time, it's had a sponsorship from 3 offices at UBC, the Vice President Research Office, and I've been involved in it from that end, but also the Vice President of Research and Innovation, Gail Murphy, the Chief Information Officer, Jennifer Burns, and the University Librarian, Susan Parker, are the key project sponsors. And then we've had a steering committee which has bridged both campuses, which covers a wide range of different research areas and includes many researchers who have deep experience in research data management issues, and also staff at the university from the library, from advanced research computing, who are expert in this area too. And I should probably say at this point that we really have relied very much on Scott Baker and Eugene Barsky, who are present today, to keep the momentum going in this project and to help organize all the discussions and thoughts for how to proceed. So my special thanks to you too. Now, our discussion today is about strategy. And I think the natural tendency when we talk about research data management in a setting of researchers is for researchers such as myself to think of their own projects and problems and to raise those in the context of discussion. And we certainly have people here who can respond to the particular needs of individual researchers, but we are here trying to think about the strategy for the institution as a whole. And so it might be helpful to think about how we separate out a strategy from the range of kind of implementation questions or specific processes that relate to an individual research program. And we've tried to separate them out here for you in general terms. So a strategy which is pointing to institutional-wide goals, and that means covering both campuses, of course, which offers a general high-level aspirations around a set of shared issues and encourages the considerations of new initiatives. And that's come out in our discussions, areas where we need to grow and develop our capacity to support research in the next decade and forward in terms of research data management. All these other more specific issues, of course, we can get into and find support for you if you have questions about it, but they're not the focus today. So with that, maybe I can turn things over to you, Scott, and you can begin to take us through aspects of the background of research data management. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. And hello, everybody. Again, thanks very much for joining us. I will just pick up right where we left off there and talk a little bit about backgrounds with what research data management is. And when we think about it, it's pretty important to consider that research data may go beyond what first pops into your mind, which would be maybe data in a tabular spreadsheet or a database or something that's coming out of a computer. When we refer to research data management and research data specifically, we're talking much more broadly. So it includes everything from musical recordings, audio recordings, photographs, various hard copies. There's audible data that can be brought forward from various communities. So it's important when you consider the strategy has to take all those varied and diverse sets of data into account when we're looking at research data management. The actual management of that research data talks about the way that we handle it, and it goes into more than just way we're handling it after the research is completed, but throughout its entire life cycle. And I'll get to a little bit more about that in a second. So when you think about that, you have to actually consider the strategy needs to look at how you're collecting the data, how you're storing it, when you're actually analyzing it. Then maybe that's going to be shared with other parties, and what happens after the research is complete. Does it need to go somewhere else? Is it going to be publicly available? Is it going to be available to other researchers? Does it go back to a community partner or a commercial partner? These are all considerations that may play into a particular research process. And a lot of what research data management involves is asking the questions about what you need to do at each one of those stages. When we look at research data management, we've taken this into account in thinking through the strategy. It's actually a component of the UBC strategic plan to have a focus on research data management and make improvements to the institutional processes in that regard. And you can see there, it's right in the number 7 for research support as part of the strategic plan. And it's also in the UBC Indigenous Strategic Plan. It also speaks to the importance of research data management, which makes perfect sense if you consider some of the elements that Matthew brought up already, the challenges and special considerations we need to keep in mind when working together with the First Nations and Indigenous communities with respect to their principles associated with data and how they want that data managed. So maybe the main impetus for this, in addition to the institutional strategic plans, has been the tri-agency RDM policy. This came out in June of 2016. And as noted, we've been working on this strategy draft for quite a while. It came out with three main pillars. One of them is that institutions do have to have an institutional strategy. And part of the reason for our timelines and our roadmap forward has been based on that requirement that they expect to have that published publicly by March 1st of next calendar year. So we do have a fairly hard deadline imposed upon us by the tri-agency. They're also looking at supporting the concepts around research data management planning. And there's efforts that the strategy speaks to that in some respects, but there's other efforts working on DMP, research data management plans as well. And then down the road, they're going to be discussing more around data deposit, but they've left that one a little more vague in the policy with the expectation it will change over time. So if you're looking for answers specifically about some of those other pillars, it's something to have a look at the actual policy from the tri-agency, but right now we're really just focused on the strategy component. They mention a little bit more detail about the strategies and what they're looking for, but when you look through some of the information they provided, it's also fairly general. They're looking to see that the strategy provides supports for good data management, good research data management, trying to look at where there's gaps and what can the institution do to address those gaps. And they've really stressed that they don't expect institutions to all come up with a very similar strategy. They've recognized that a big institution may have one set of needs and be more mature in some areas than others, and a smaller institution will have completely different needs and have different levels of maturity that they're working within. So they acknowledge and expect the strategies are going to be quite different as you look at all the different institutions across Canada. And they're not trying to hold institutions to a particular form or expectation of what those strategies are going to include. They just want people to have thought through the items that pertain to them and propose what they want to see done to make progress in that area. So to that end, what UBC has been doing, we started along that concept of the gaps by asking ourselves the question, where are we now and where do we want to go? And we used something called the RISE maturity model. It was a self-evaluation proposed by the UK's Digital Curation Centre that allows you to sort of score yourself in a bunch of different preset goals and see, okay, where are we on these goals on a scale of 1 to 3, where 1 is we're just kind of getting started and 3 is, we're leaders in this particular space. And a large part of the work that was conducted over the course of the last couple of years was working through this model, asking people in the community, where do you think the important areas are? What's the priorities? And where are we? Where are we now in each one of these different areas? And that really has informed the strategy by looking at what kind of responses we got. And there were some clear themes that made coming up with some of the elements of the draft strategy much easier because there was a lot of consistency in what we heard back. You can see more about the way that model works and what responses we heard on the information website that's linked there. And it's the QR codes that have popped up on the screen and some of the other links, it's all on the same site. So if you're interested more about what the RISE model looks like and how that fits together, you can see that information on the site. It will eventually form a component of the strategy as an appendix, although the draft, we haven't integrated that just yet. So what does this draft strategy look like? Basically follows that RISE model that I just mentioned. So it has goals. The wording of the goals is very, very similar to the wording of the RISE goals. In most cases, word for word, we changed a couple of them to make it more consistent. But in each case, you'll have the goal as defined by the RISE model. Some basic prose about what we heard back from the community around that topic, and then recommendations that have come out of that consultation process around what we heard people felt were very important things to address, where there were significant gaps. And in certain cases, you may notice that for a particular goal, there are not a lot of recommendations that may speak to what's in the model. And that was simply because people didn't feel there was a strong pressure to work in that particular area. I should stress also that these recommendations and the strategy itself will eventually become a living document. It's something that will change over time. So as you start and we make progress in a particular area, eventually, hopefully, we'll make improvements there, progress in the maturity in that particular area, and be able to go back and say, okay, we've put in the effort in this one space. Now we can revisit the model and maybe we should be redirecting our efforts to a different topic area. So I'll briefly just walk through, and we're not expecting everybody's had a chance to read through the draft, although it is posted in its entirety on that website. You may not have had a chance to read through the draft just yet. We'd encourage you to do that, especially before the focus sessions. If you want to join us for one of those where we'll dive a little deeper, please do have a read through the strategy and see the detail that comes along with these recommendations. But I'll walk through some of the key ones that we found. And these, again, are based on where we received the most feedback from the community. So one of the elements there, and they're not in necessarily a priority order, they're just in groupings that make sense. But we heard a lot that people want to have a centralized source of information around research data management. They're finding that right now you have to go to a bunch of different areas to get information and put the whole thing together because it encompasses a lot of different things, that whole data life cycle. So the library has some excellent resources on it. ARC has good resources on it. Ethics has good resources on it. There's other supports out of IT in different parts of the institution that also have resources on it. And a lot of departments and faculties have their own resources related to research data management. But we heard from a lot of folks that what they'd like to see is something central, something where we can pull all this together, even if it's just redirecting people to those resources. There doesn't currently exist one place you can go and get it all. And that was a strong request from a lot of the consultation that we heard. Related to that, and all the recommendations on this slide are kind of related to that, some sort of a unified communication strategy to let people know about research data management, what the best practices are, where to find the information that they need, to just raise that level of awareness. So there was a lot of folks that haven't heard necessarily about what already exists to support them in their research data management needs. And we heard quite frequently that people were, through the focus sessions, actually learning about resources they didn't know were available. And then some centralized options to support the actual planning process, which has to answer those questions around the data lifecycle that we talked about just before. So how am I going to store my data when I collect it? How am I going to keep it secure? What am I going to do afterwards? Which repository should I use? Which repository is suitable? Do I have to destroy data, some of the data? Do I have to return it to a different partner or community? How does all that work? And those questions all need to be answered as part of data management planning. And how do people do those? Sometimes there's support needed to answer those, understand what resources exist. So that was a key one, to try to centralize some of that resource as well. Related to that, answering those questions is sort of one aspect of it, but actually creating a data management plan that is effective and will become a requirement under that tri-agency policy is another one that people would like some help with. And there are, again, good resources that exist, but they're not always the easiest to find. So there was another recommendation that we heard loud and clear was people would like more assistance around the data management planning process itself. How do you create them? Where do you store them? What should they look like? What level of detail was a big one, because you could be very detailed or not that detailed in a data management plan. So some assistance there. And then the other one that we heard quite often is there's challenges around seeking appropriate storage for research data. And that storage can change throughout the life cycle. You have everything from, I'm collecting data from some sort of an app and I need a place to store it right now, but I'll eventually move it somewhere else, to at the end of a Health Canada study where you have to keep data for 25 years. And where do I do that? And how do I plan for that? So some supports for looking at storing different kinds of data, different classifications of that data throughout the entire life cycle was another key recommendation to look at as part of the strategy. And then finally, and it was mentioned briefly on that one slide that talked about what the strategy is and isn't, implementing some of these things is not what the strategy is going to say exactly how to do. It says we need to look at ways that we can do some of these things. These would be areas that we should strive for, but actually how to implement it will need to be addressed as well. And so the final key recommendation was to actually form a group to look at implementing the recommendations of the strategy, seeing which ones we can do, what resources would be required. Some of them, there's lots of different ways you could do it, try to come up with the best way to make progress in a particular area. So that's to look at the go forward. And this goes back to that aspect that this document will likely become a living document. It will change over time as we move forward with new recommendations that become obvious. The landscape will change around research. So everything has to be a little bit fluid as we move ahead. But right now we're trying to get to that point where we have that strategy published publicly online in order to meet the deadline for the tri-agency policy. So how do we get there? Those next steps, we're looking to, through this process, starting with this town hall today, we have another one tomorrow that will be hosted at the UBC O campus. We have the 4 focus sessions coming up, and we're also meeting with different groups that have regular meetings as well. And we can't guarantee we'll have the time, but if you have a group or faculty meeting or a department meeting and you'd like more information, you can certainly reach out. And if we have time and can come to speak to this, we'd be more than happy to. But we're trying to wrap up collecting additional feedback by the end of October. And the reason for that date is we then have to look at that feedback, pull it all together, see what needs to change in the draft. And we really have to get it back to our project sponsors before the end of the calendar year. So we're aiming for a December 5th deadline for that. And the reason for some of these deadlines is, as I mentioned, the actual final strategy must be published before March 1st of 2023. So we have to get it through the final approvals, make it look nice, and then get it posted online where it can live until we start getting into that implementation phase. So those are our next general steps. That's why we're so keen on getting some feedback as soon as we can, so we can start looking at, where have we hit the mark, where have we missed the mark, what should change, did we completely miss a particular area that's of vital importance, anything like that we can adjust. And I'm reiterating the how to get involved that Matthew already mentioned. This town hall is our first take at sort of giving an overview of what's in the strategy and how to interpret it. We're really doing the same thing again tomorrow with the UBC Okanagan hosted town hall. But where we're really hoping to get into a more fulsome discussion is at these focus sessions that span the latter part of September and into October. And while they're themed around a particular topic, everybody is welcome to any one of the sessions. So if you're not working with Indigenous data, but you're interested, feel free to come to that session or all of the sessions or any one of the sessions. It's entirely up to you. Those sessions will be a Zoom meeting format, so we can actually have more of a discussion rather than a presentation and a Q&A. We're hoping to actually talk through what we see in the strategy as it relates to these different topics and get direct feedback. We had a great feedback last year when we did something similar without the draft in hand, where we were just looking at the RISE model, and really appreciate all the feedback that we received. There were some great discussions, so we're very much hoping for the same this time around. So at this point, that's really all we have in terms of presenting what's going on with the strategy and where we currently are, and hopefully provides a little bit of background on what you'll expect when you read through it. And I'd like to open it up at this point if anybody has any questions or thoughts or needs more information around any particular topic. As noted, you can ask in either the chat or the Q&A, and Eugene is monitoring those. And we just have to make sure that if anybody here wants to ask a question, we'll have to make sure they have a mic, because other people won't be able to hear them.
Start online.
If there's online questions.
Scott, there's no online questions for now.
Nothing yet. Maybe I can pose an idea to get people thinking. So jumping back to some of those key recommendations and thinking about where they are. And those aren't the only recommendations out of the strategy, I should note. Those were the sort of the 5 that we had the most feedback about. So we pulled those out, plus the implementation committee one. But there's lots more recommendations that come out of each one of the goals following the RISE model. That I think one of the ones you see sort of as a theme throughout a lot of those is the centralization of the sort of findability of resources related to research data management. If I was going to try to summarize a bunch of what we heard, people were looking for ways to get to the information that may already exist. So there's already supports, there's already information. They don't know it's there. They haven't heard about research data management planning. They don't know how to make a research data management plan. And unless they actually go looking for it, they don't stumble across that information in the rest of their daily process and pathway through their research career. So there's this goal to try to make that more accessible, where people will actually find that information without having to explicitly go and look for it. We heard quite regularly the request, is there a way to integrate this into the things that we already do? If I was to summarize it. And where I'm going with this in terms of maybe having it spur some thoughts or questions, does anybody think of general ways? I know there's lots of specific ways where you might have a program or you might have a regular meeting. Are there general ways that would be very good to do that we maybe should make sure the strategy looks at when we talk about the centralization of awareness aspects of research data management?
Hi, Scott. This is Matthew speaking. While we wait for others, can I pose a hypothetical question to you?
By all means.
So I can imagine a scenario, let's just say I'm a health scientist and I've had great support from the Faculty of Medicine in research data management for some of my projects. And I've had big data sets that have had to be managed and I've needed some really hands-on support. Does this centralization discussion mean that I'm going to lose access to that support? How should I be viewing this discussion of centralization?
So one of the items that came out of a lot of the focus sessions, it was quite clear that certain departments, certain faculties, and even certain labs, you can take it at different levels, have very mature research data management processes that are already in place. And there's really no intention of the strategy to change what people are already doing well. It's a lot more about looking at those groups that don't have access to those kind of resources or are struggling with finding places to store their data, to support what they do with it as even during active storage. Sometimes people have trouble while they're actually collecting it, knowing where it should go. They have, and we continue to get more and more complicated collection mechanisms involving mobile apps, Internet of Things, and cloud providers. And how can that be supported from a good research data management perspective? But the strategy itself is not intending to co-opt anything that's already there or adjust it or change it. We know there's some very established processes that see research data in certain areas, certain disciplines, right the way through from collection through to deposit in existing repositories. And they're operating and humming along quite nicely. A lot of this is more about trying to help the folks that don't have access to that kind of resource now, or have access to the resource but don't know they do and need to find a way to be aware of it. So the awareness component is a big one. As I mentioned, there's quite a few resources that exist that people might not know are there. I think I'll add one other tangential thing as well. It kind of talked to it in that what a strategy is and isn't, but I've heard in a lot of our consultations and with meeting with other institutions across the country, a lot of people tend to confuse the strategy with a policy. And I think that's another important distinction. What we're working on drafting here is a research data management strategy, not a policy. So it's not something that's going to have statements in it like so-and-so must do X or must do Y. There's no compliance component. There's no forced expectation of a certain set of actions or procedures. It's a lot more about, it would be great if we can do these things better than we are now. And here's some ways that we might be able to accomplish those things.
Thanks, Scott. There's a question online that's anonymous. I will read it and you and I will try to answer it. I haven't read anything in the strategy so far about contributing to open data. Any consideration for this going to be included in the strategy, as it's the case that increasingly funding agencies and journals are requiring us as part of the terms? And I can, if you don't mind, I can try to answer that, because this is the area the library has been working the most. So the strategy addresses coordinated efforts to work with a research data as a campus. Each of us has a part to play. The library has been working in open data area for quite a while. We have the largest research data repository in Canada with more than 1,000 data sets, all of them open. Most of those data sets are coming as a result of funding agencies, journals, requesting and requiring data to be open. So we definitely work with open data, and we definitely will continue working with open data. But in the strategy, we would like to do it more collaboratively and as an institution.
And I can add to that as well. The tri-agencies, when they've spoken to it, I think it's actually printed right on the RDM policy page that their policy, this policy, is not an open access policy. A lot of the principles that are behind why open access is a component of a lot of funding and a component of a lot of journals are enshrined within that policy, or things like the FAIR principles, and the strategy will support those kind of activities. But in and of itself, they already have a lot of policies and requirements in place through tri-agency that require open access. And there are, as Eugene mentioned, a lot of supports related to it. So I think the strategy's take on assisting folks with the open access aspects of research data management will again be around training and awareness, centralization of the directory of where you would find those services, ensuring that the storage options are considered for what kind of storage might be required for some of those, especially the longer term stuff is a challenge for a lot of folks, where you have to keep data for long periods of time, and especially these very large data sets. That's a challenge area for a lot of folks to find places to store large amounts of data for long periods of time in order to meet some of the open access requirements. So those are aspects the strategy is trying to suggest we need to look at, areas we need to try to improve and make a bit of a focus. But in terms of, again, any sort of direct specific support for open access itself, a lot of that's being covered in different ways already in different sort of areas and through different policies and requirements. Anything else on the?
Let me try another question then for you, Scott. It's turning to an internal discussion. So please, if you're online and you're contemplating whether to pose a question, just go for it. But in the town halls previously, we had a lot of questions come up and ideas around the overlap between research data management and ethics. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how the strategy addresses that.
Sure. And yes, I think every single focus session and the town halls last year, at least one representative joined us from ethics, from one of the different ethics boards or in that area, and always got into a position where they were answering almost as many questions as us, because people had a lot of questions around that relationship. If you consider what the research data lifecycle entails through the collection of that data, managing it through its whole life cycle, you have to make sure it's protected. If it's a study that involves ethics in any way, there's such a tight relationship between the way you're going to manage your research data and the ethics process that it's almost impossible to extricate the two. So when we look at something like research data management planning, which asks questions of how are you going to collect your data, where are you going to store it, what are you going to do with that data at the conclusion of the study? These are the exact same questions that are already part of the ethics application. So one of the things that we've spoken to in the strategy already is, again, that coordination between the aspects of IT components of your data and your storage, the security components of how your processes are going to work and your architectures, and then tying that together with ethics. The other one is the research data management planning process. We've seen concern from people that, this is another thing that they might have to do. It's additional work. Everybody's got too much administrative burden that they have to deal with right now. So one of the other recommendations in the strategy talks to the fact that we want to coordinate that so that people don't have to do two different, slightly different questions around the exact same thing. If it's asking, how are you going to store your data during a research project in the data management plan, and ethics really wants to know the exact same thing, how can we make that more streamlined? How can we have that question get answered once, either as part of a data management plan that gets amended to the ethics application, or the questions are worded exactly the same? Again, the strategy won't look at how exactly to implement that, but it's strongly identifying the fact that we need to find a way to make that more cohesive, to reduce any duplication of effort and ensure that the processes around research data management and the processes that stem from ethics are working together to really streamline that. I think that was one of the key areas. The other one kind of relates to that training and awareness piece, where ethics And they do this now, as well as the library, as well as ARC. We all have different training and workshop sessions that we offer to support people in that planning process. So ethics tries to support them in understanding how best to fill out those questions and think about what they're going to do in their research project to ensure it's ethically sound. The library is looking at a lot of the aspects of making sure they're practicing good data management in terms of metadata and the storage of that data, preservation of the data, curation of the data. ARC, we're looking at, what you're doing while you're actively storing it. Is it secure? Are you keeping it secure? What are the best ways to move large chunks of data around? And this relates again to that people would like to have those different lenses combined into a single kind of a support workshop, something that would give them an overview of research data management from all those perspectives at once. Because when we're looking at, for example, in ARC, the security of the data, and ethics is asking, how are you protecting that data to protect the participants? It's largely the same question. And so we want to work together to find a way to provide that information in a more unified sense.
Thanks, Scott. There's another question online. So as you were talking about differences between strategy and policy, Scott, is the eventual goal of the RDM strategy to develop institutional or discipline-specific policy or policies? Maybe I'll give it to Matthew to answer.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think what I would say is that there isn't an intention to develop disciplinary specific policies or even an institutional policy, although research data management, we can imagine in future iterations of the university research policy that it might be flagged in a different way. But I think what we're trying to emphasize is that the strategy is pointing towards a whole range of practical programs that we need to pursue on the implementation side in the coming years to support our campus communities in the pursuit of good research data management practices. So I don't know if I'm splitting hairs between talking about the strategy and implementation versus policy. Policy development may be another stage, but it's not something that's particularly envisaged here.
I can add to that too, that one of the elements of the RISE model does speak to governance policy frameworks around research data management. And this was an area that we didn't get much feedback about during the town halls and the focus sessions last year, other than some discussion of did people feel that there was a need for policy. And in large sense, what we heard back was, again, we have the UBC research policies, we have policies around security, we have policies around ethics already, and that largely anything that a research data management policy would be able to enshrine has pretty much largely been covered through these different, it's not a single overarching policy that has it all in one place, but in the structure of the university governance and policies, a lot of it's already there. So it didn't seem to be, it certainly wasn't a high priority piece from what we heard speaking with the community last year, especially compared to some of these other things when we looked at, lots of people getting back to us about that importance of the alignment with the ethics process and the training and awareness piece. Any other thoughts?
Well, you've answered my question, Scott. Are there any further questions online or from the group in the room I'd like to pose? Okay. So why don't we give it another minute. If anyone would like to enter a question in the Q&A, we're happy to answer. And just a reminder again of the different mechanisms to offer feedback and to please reach out to colleagues who might be interested. A, to have a look at the strategy, and B, to submit comments about the direction it's taken. These would be most helpful to us. And also, if you have questions you'd like to raise that don't fit in a feedback form, feel free to write to Eugene, Scott, or me, or anyone on the advisory committee. Happy to answer questions. And here's one other question.
Thanks, Matthew. Another question to us is, Many of the recommendations appear to be needed regardless of the tri-agency strategy requirement. Is anything currently being done to work on these requirements in advance of the strategy being finalized, e.g. more centralized support?
So yeah, it's a great question. And yes, some of these initiatives have already started. There's grassroots groups that have been working in some of these areas even before the strategy draft was a thing. I know for a fact that there's groups meeting right now to look at how can supports be offered from a data management planning perspective. That's one initiative. Trying to look at the information that could go into a centralized portal for more information about research data management from all those different lenses. And that's one of those groups that's bringing together folks. I know there's folks on that from ARC, from the library, from different campuses, not just UBC Vancouver, and ethics. They're all meeting together to talk about some of those things. I think there's a lot of efforts being done in other respects around where we can look in a forward-thinking respect to some of these data storage questions. And those questions are also being done. The goal of the strategy and some of these recommendations is to highlight these activities and needs. And maybe it'll help these groups, again, with a sort of more formal, yes, what you're doing is exactly one of the things we need to be doing. But there's definitely efforts underway in a bunch of these areas already. And I think that's where that central resource may actually be able to pull together and shine a bit of a light on some of that work that's already being done. Because yes, the point of this strategy, at least our approach to it, was not to just create some sort of a box tick effort to satisfy the tri-agency policy. That's why we've spent so much time reaching out to the community, trying to find out where the pain points are, what areas we really need to improve, using the RISE model to get some sort of a framework around that so we could categorize and define the areas that we need to work on, and then prioritize that effort through the strategy. But it's not about the tri-agency policy specifically, although that's obviously a significant driver. It's really about improving research data management practices for the institution in general. Maybe I can add just one more thing about the feedback form. I know that sometimes, and with timing, and it's September and everybody's very, very busy, it may be that you can't attend this, well, any of the sessions even. That doesn't mean that there's not the ability to read through the strategy and provide feedback on the feedback form, even if somebody can't attend. So back to Matthew's original plea to please forward this to your colleagues. Let them know that the draft is available for them to read. It's publicly available. Anybody's welcome to look at it. And we're very keen to see feedback posted through that feedback form, which is a very simple form. It really just asks who you are and what you want to say. So you can say as much or as little as you want and submit it as many times as you want. And we'll pull that together as best we can. This session also, I think you heard when you joined on Zoom, is being recorded. And we will post either this one or the one from tomorrow, depending on where the discussion goes or if there's any problems with the recording, so that somebody who's missed the session today or tomorrow will be able to have a watch through one of the two recordings anyway.
With that, should we call it to a close then, Scott?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for attending the session today. We do appreciate your time and we hope you appreciate getting 15 minutes back. Okay, have a great day, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Bye-bye.